Well done. I think it would be a great time now to open it up for some questions and answers.
Well, thank you. And it's been extremely important. We have a question here. Let me just reach out to it. There's a question. I can say the name or not. I'm going to say the comment. I totally agree. Being a queer could very possibly be the middle point where folks can meet and talk about the issues. This is a comment. Would you like to address it, expand a little bit?
Janet, could you read it one more time?
Absolutely. I totally agree. Being a queer could very possibly be the middle point where folks can meet and talk about the issues.
I'm biased, firstly. But I think what can really be taken away is that the queer community has set a profound example of what can happen when you set aside differences and you embrace the intersectionality that majority of us face. And when you can set aside those differences and start working together to create one goal, we have a path. And the queer community it's this beautiful rainbow. It's hard to miss, and I think that path that they've created for us is, and in doing so, they've left us tools. We can look at the history and see what they've done, and look to that path, that way of being, that way of doing. Much of Anishinaabe knowings and learning is done by example, leading by example. Long ago, we carried our babies in something called a papoose. And this papoose would be carried on its parents' back on a cradle board. And when the parents were invested in community, the cradle board was propped up. And so the baby was always able to see what was happening in the community, was always able to understand the roles and responsibilities of community members and family members. And that's how you lead by example, right? And I think that that's what the queer community has done. It's created this toolbox for us by being leaders and creating those examples of what we need to do. And the first step of that is starting to story share and in order to remove those stigmas, remove the indifferences, remove those things, because the common goal is the equality of love, right? And what the common goal right now for Indigenous racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and anti-Black racism is equality. Like, let's break down Black Lives Matter for just a hot second. It's Black lives matter. Matter. Let's say that word one more time. Matter. They're just asking to matter. You can't get any lower than that. It'd be what? Exist? Right? So what we need to do is that we need to start following the examples of the queer community, setting aside stigmas, setting aside stereotypes, setting aside the differences, and start working towards that common goal, which for the Black and Indigenous community is justice. Whereas for the queer community, it was the equality of love and justice, but the equality of love. I hope that expands a little bit on that.
Okay. I have another question here.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier you mentioned about tokenization and being invited to the table just to check a box.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a space and a world look like when we have real conversations about truth and, as you mentioned, reconciliation? How does that look like?
So it looks like action. It looks like when you are inviting a BIPOC, faculty, administrator, worker, counselor, whoever they are, to the table, then you're saying to them, we honor your voice in this space. We're not talking over top of them. We're not dismissing their comments. We're not making judgment calls like, well, that's too intense, or that's not the right time to be talking about that, or many of the various things that Joanna mentioned in her poem, right? It's about action steps. It's about saying, well, if you are invited to this table, then your voice is respected and honored here, and it will be heard. And your thoughts will be talked about and discussed and welcomed. That's what it looks like.
Thank you. At this point, I just want to remind all the people who are in attendance that you can send a direct question to Leigh through Facebook. You can send an email to vp@mycesar.ca, vp-equity, at mycesar.ca. You can also put a question in the Q&A box. We had a comment from one of the attendees, and they said, thank you, for your courage to give us this keynote. And another question that I have now, and it also, you mentioned a little bit before, it had to do with, you mentioned about having the courage to lean forward, and that can be really scary. So if we take this step to lean forward in the solidarity work, what we do, where does this lead us? What could be the possible result from this?
So the possible result is change, because that is what we're asking for. We're asking for change. And what history teaches us is that Indigenous people alone, while have made change, it's been a slow progression of change. Black communities across Turtle Island have been fighting for change on their own. And yes, while there has been change, not enough has happened when we're still watching Black bodies being brutalized. So it is in that solidarity, power in numbers, my friends, power in numbers. Even all of society stands together and says that this is not working, then the governments that govern us have no choice but to create reform.
Okay, this is a little bit more speaking to what the whole presentation is. And we understand you're not speaking for all the Indigenous communities, but within the connections that you're at right now, what are the Indigenous communities doing during this current political climate with everything that is happening?
So again, I can't speak for all Indigenous communities. I think all communities are taking action. I can speak to what Serpent River First Nations has been doing. I am very proud to say that we are led by a two-spirited chief. And I follow closely on our Facebook page, and statements of support on Black Lives Matter, statements of support on Pride have all been released. And that is something that we have not yet seen coming from the reservation from Serpent River First Nations. And I'm just so honored and thrilled that those recognition are being done by Chief and Council. And, you know, in doing so, creating that awareness for proactive change, you know, is what Serpent River has been doing. From a personal perspective, I'm really trying to keep the dialogues going. I'm really trying to keep the conversations moving and not letting them die out, and ensuring that we all start looking towards how are we connected. You know, that is Indigenous pedagogy around the world looks at connection from the two-legged to the four-legged to the swimmers, the crawlers, the flyers, the animate, the inanimate, the water. We are all connected. And there is such richness in that, understanding those connections and how grounding it is to be a part of those connections, a part of Mother Earth, a part of all Mother Earth has to provide. In understanding your place within all of that connection helps us to move forward in a good way. Does that answer that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you. You obviously you're in a post-secondary education institution, and we know that one of the things that was lost due to colonization was language, and with language, culture, history, more connections. What can be done, not necessarily by you or right here at Ryerson, but what can be done to restore language? And if that is too big of a question, the part that maybe you can speak about is, if we were to speak right here, right now, where we are in the Southern Ontario part of this Turtle Island, what are the most, the widest spoken languages?
So I would love to talk about languages, just because that's very personal for me. So I'm going to story share a little bit. I am who I am, and I feel the way I feel, and the thoughts that I have because of the people that raised me. When my mother was a child, an Indian agent came to my grandparents' house and told them that they could no longer speak Anishinaabekwe to their children. And in doing so, many of my aunts and uncles, and my mother included, lost the ability to speak Anishinaabekwe. I cannot speak for my aunties and my uncles. I can only speak to what my mother has shared, and that is that it is one of her biggest points of pain. And the reason that it is one of the biggest points of pain is that Anishinaabekwe is not just words, but they convey emotions and feelings. And so when you're trying to say something, the English language can't translate it because there is emotion written into the language. And I think that's the point of pain, is that ability to emotionally convey was stolen. So not only were the words stolen, but the emotions behind the words were also stolen. And I think that that is a large point of pain for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. Personally, not knowing the language comes with an immense sense of shame. It's not my shame to own, but it is shame nonetheless. I listened to Shane introduce himself in his language, and it's beautiful to me. And I look forward to the day that I can, you know, call Shane up one day and introduce myself in Anishinaabekwe. And I really hope that that day comes for me, because I really would like to reclaim the language, if not for me, then for my mother, and not for my mothers, and for my aunties and uncles, and if not for my family, then for my grandmother, who, you know, I love sharing this story. A few years ago, my my auntie Tilly gave me my grandmother's craft box, which is huge because my grandmother was this beautiful crafter, and I'm so blessed that I have her crafts. And in this craft box were all of these mini cassettes. I don't know if y'all remember those mini little cassettes. So I hunted down a mini cassette player. And I was so desperate to hear her voice. I just thought, please, please just let her voice be somewhere on this. It had been 20 years since I had heard it. And I listened to all of these tapes. There's about 8 of them. And I listened to Dead Air for hours and hours and hours. And on the very last tape, on side B, at the very end, I hear my grandmother say, "Hello, Ani." And she starts speaking in Anishinaabe. And so I took this tape to a language speaker, and I was like, "Can you please tell me what my grandmother's talking about?" And in this tape, my grandmother is recording a community meeting on language preservation.
Wow.
And she's talking about how can we restore the language back into the youth and to the younger. So I would love to learn it. It is a point of pain that colonization has brought for me personally and for my family, I think. And I would love to be able to embrace that and be able to, because I still speak to my grandparents every day. So I would love to surprise them one day and talk to them in Anishinaabe.
Mm. Oh, that would be so beautiful, indeed. We have a question, and I'm going to invite the speaker if they want to maybe open up their video camera, or you can actually do it if the person wants to. So I'm going to read the question. It comes from Omid. What are other POC, people of color, persons of color, supposed to do, like brown, Asian, South American, etc.? What are other POCs supposed to do when we're watching fight for change between Indigenous, Black, and white folks, beside sharing posts on social media, as this is what is seems to is happening, right? This is what is happening in the moment. So the comment continues as not to say that POCs are not helping at all. So Omid wants to open his camera, and he's on Facebook. So I don't know if this is technically possible. I'm asking if that not from Facebook. Okay.
Well, Omid, firstly, I thank you for your question. It's a great question. I work with many people of color at my place of employment. I've also had many beautiful conversations with them. And I started like the conversations that they've been having with me was that they're really starting to have these dialogues within their communities. They're starting to talk about anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism within their families and within their communities. And I think that's a great start because it's telling the truth. Here are my thoughts on this. Based on my teaching experiences and my experiences working with people of color, and I want to specifically really hone in on students right now, is that there is such an immense sense of guilt and shame and fragility from other people of color, other communities with people of color. And that is because so many of their families fled countries that were experiencing similar oppressions. And they come to Canada in hopes of a better life and a better future. And in time, they find they find out the truth. And the truth is that there are these Indigenous communities that are suffering atrocities that they've escaped their countries from. And they become very disheartened and very upset. And they want to make changes and they want to participate, and they quite often become the greatest of allies because they have that authentic empathy, meaning they have this empathy based on a shared lived experience. So they end up often becoming the greatest allies. Unfortunately, what's also happened in this process of coming from other countries or coming from those families is that we as Canadian citizens have been lied to our entire educational careers up until about 5 years ago. And so these stigmas, these stereotypes about Indigenous peoples are infiltrated into all of these other communities. And so all of these other communities start to believe these stereotypes about Indigenous people. We don't pay taxes, the addictions and mental health is rampant. There are all these myths, that are accrued through colonization. And all of these myths and stereotypes get infiltrated into all these other communities. And so, Omid, what I'm saying to you is that if you recognize that these stereotypes are existing within your community, then having those conversations within your community in a relatable way is a great way to start telling the truth. And so that you collectively in your community can start working on what does reconciliation look like, from your perspective, from your lived experiences. I really want us to move away from like the checkbox system that we seem to be finding ourselves in. Land acknowledgement, check. Indigenous person on the board, check. Indigenous people in the committee, check. I really want us to shift away from this like checkboxing system that we seem to have happening right now. And that's only going to happen is if we start having these conversations instead of start looking at each other as checkboxes. We need to start recognizing that our humanity and our stories and our lived experiences. And then you can start on reconciliation. But that happens with dialogue. So Omid, I ask that I'm asking, if you are asking what's next, what to do, I'm asking you to start those conversations within your community, because that is how we come together, is when we share those stories and we hear each other's stories.
Thank you. And being from the Latin American community myself, my ears were very open to your answers, so thank you. We have a question from a Métis Cree cis queer woman. And so I'm going to read it. Chimiwech Lee, for holding the space for us along with Shane and Janet. My question is about the stories we tell ourselves and those we pass on from our lives. We tell ourselves all kinds of stories about ourselves and how we discern between positive social narratives versus holding in stories that have been told to us that are untrue. Your comments?
AKA internalized oppression. It would be a lie to say that we are not all, every single person, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, are on a spectrum of colonization. We all are colonized to some degree. Janet, can you read it again? I want to speak to it.
Sure.
I just read it to me one more time.
For sure. My question is about the stories we tell ourselves and those we pass on from our lives. We tell ourselves all kinds of stories about ourselves. How do we discern between positive social narratives versus holding in stories that have been told to us that are untrue?
Okay, so the connection I want to make with this is about conditioning. So that's where I was going with the colonization piece, is that we have been conditioned to have these self-beliefs about ourselves. I'm going to be very, very honest with you. I did not come in to my family until the spring of last year. Woo! I was completely out with family and friends, and but I was not with my family. And that is not because I thought that my family was going to love me any less, or because I was afraid I was going to be kicked out of community. Those were not my fears. I had been conditioned to believe that success meant that I checked all the check boxes. Does that make sense? Went to school, got a degree, check. Had a couple of children, check. Married a man, check. All of these things that I was conditioned to believe equaled success. Why was that important to me? It was important to me because I was Indigenous, and the world saw me as the stereotypes that exist. The world saw me as a failure. The world saw me as an alcoholic. The world saw me as a criminal. The world saw me as savage. The world saw me as not worthy. And so checking that checkbox becomes incredibly important for me. It did. It doesn't now, but it did. It became incredibly important. And that was the conditioning. So we are all have this level of self-conditioning to believe what we should be and who we shouldn't be. But let me tell you what happens when we live in denial. When we let the conditioning take us, when we let colonization seeps into our hearts, we become sick. We become ill. Our thoughts become sad. We disconnect from those that we love. And eventually, we start thinking about disconnecting from life. And then something rattles us so hard to my core, my story, that I was done and I needed to start being authentically me. I needed to let go of the conditioning. I needed to break free of the last chain colonization had around my ankle. And so I so bravely came into my family last spring. And while there was an adjustment period for that truth to set in, I think that my family sees my authenticity now, and they see, for the first time, authentic joy in my heart. And when we break those chains of colonization, when we break those chains of self-conditioning, we create space for change and solidarity. Because me even sharing this story, I know many of you are seeing kinship in it. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. These questions come mediated through Facebook. So I'm just going to, if they have any other comments, they are welcome to. I have another comment here from Jeremy Caribou. And they say, a lot of communities lack website for people to explore their culture and history. What is worse is the digital divide and access to information.
Again, it is ridiculous to me that that is a thing, that in 2020, there are communities and reservations that do not have access to internet. And when I say that we need to hold our governments to the utmost, highest accountability, this is exactly where I mean. We need to do it. These are acts of ignorance and blatant just disregard on the Canadian government side. And it basically says you're not worthy. And so what it does is it creates a divide. And so we have all of these rural Indigenous people that are starving for identity, starving because colonization has done such a number on their communities. Assimilation has done such a number on their communities. And what we're seeing, and again, this is my thoughts, is that I do see the eighth fire rising. I encourage you all to go look up the seven fire prophecies so that you understand what I mean when I say the eighth fire is rising. And to put it all in a nutshell, it is to say that the time for youth and women have come to lead the way and to restore us back in balance with Mother Nature and with one another. And I see that coming. I see that happening. But that can't happen until every Indigenous person has the same equal rights as everybody, every other Canadian citizen here. Tell me, please explain to me, Canadian government, why, oh, why we can't have internet in these communities. Explain to me, Canadian government, why, oh, why my brothers and sisters in the North are paying $8 for a bag of milk. Please explain to me, Canadian government, why, oh, why it is so important to keep this divide and widen it. I need those answers just as much as you do, my friend. And we don't have them yet. We don't have them yet. And what all I can do is encourage those that can to get in and to start making those changes. And we can only do that by supporting one another.
Let me unmute myself. And there's one comment here, and it says, I understand that silence equals complicity, and that impacts us all in different struggle around anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness, and the many other social ills. What does breaking the silence look like, and how can we not be silent without taking the mic? I can repeat that if you...
I think it's about letting go of ego.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that a lot of the reason people stay silent is because they don't want to rock their own boats. They don't want to make people of their caliber, of their power, of their equality uncomfortable with conversations that need to be had. And so they stay silent because of their own egotistical fear of being judged by their communities. And so they stay silent, not because they don't support and not because they don't care and not because, they're a bad ally, but because they allow their ego to be bigger than the change that needs to occur. It's something I very much struggle with, is the silence with among others, because to my very core, I understand it to come from ego. It is a place of just wanting to protect self-interest. So let's not have the conversation because I don't want to rock my boat. I don't want it to get tipsy. I don't want to have uncomfortable conversations. I don't want to be singled out. I don't want to rock my boat. So shame on you and your ego.
So let me ask you this question, which is moving into a more of what can we do? How do you think through the Indigenous worldview we can move forward in good ways, in good relations?
Yeah, so I think that's really been the crux of what this conversation has been about today. And that's really about recognizing the connections, recognizing kinship, really creating spaces like this one to hear and share stories. Like, I think that when we, just like Richard Wagamasi says, when we create space to really, truly listen to one another's stories, we do find the kinship, we do find the similarities, and in that we find the solidarity. And that solidarity is needed from the Black community, it's needed from the Indigenous community, it's needed from the Pride community, it's needed from POP community. It's just needed all around for us to all come together and start creating change and lessen the oppressions that people are feeling you know, it's time for change. And I truly do believe we are all ready.
Thank you so much. I have a question that could be, heavy, just because the whole conversation it's been frustrating in so many ways. A year ago, the report about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls came about.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 215 calls to action. Out of the 215 calls to actions and thousands of words, the whole media focused on the word genocide. And everybody went up in arms and got horrified, and the whole conversation went to the use of one word or not. Is it right? Is it not right? And it was it hijacked the conversation of why are women and girls who are Indigenous or Two-Spirited being killed? We took a year or a few years to do this report, and suddenly no one's talking about the issue. So for someone who's trying to not stay silent, what would you say? Like, don't look at the shiny stuff. Where should we be looking at? Who should we be listening to?
I used to I had a professor in my undergrad. Her name is Janet York, and she used to always talk about her third eye. And what I learned to understand is that is the critical eye. It is the eye that picks apart what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you're learning, and then unlearning it and seeing where it really originates from. So to answer your question, I think the critical perspective on that is, who decided that the debate would be about the word genocide and not about the report? And then who and why is that the conversation that's happening and not the one that needs to be happening? Because if you break it all down, you understand that there are people that don't want to rock the boat. And so what they do is that they create a diversion topic. And that takes everybody's eyes off of the topic at hand, the thing that needs to be looked at, needs to be addressed, and says, no, we're going to talk about this. Why? Many reasons. Too intense, don't want to rock the boat. If we find this, then we have to admit our wrongdoing. And if we have to admit to our wrongdoing, how much of our wrongdoing do we have to admit? And then this is our judicial system. Probably the powers that be are going to be saying it's not good for people to question our judicial system. To that, I say too late. I think everybody's already doing that at this point. But it is people that don't want to rock the boat. So having that, using that critical eye and saying, like, who, what, where, why, and when. Like, why are we talking about genocide when we should be talking about, why Indigenous women and girls are going missing? Why are they being murdered? What is happening? Why is this not being addressed? It seems much like a diversion. So what you can do is stay on topic. Every time you see that go one way, you grab it and you bring it back and you recenter it again, and you keep plugging away at that. Sometimes it feels like you have like a mini chisel and hammer, and you're just kind of plucking away at it, but eventually it'll all break down. So I think that when you're trying to do that kind of advocacy work and you're getting frustrated because your critical eye is seeing that there is a diversion happening from, the core reason that you're there or that you're listening, is often because they don't want it to be seen, right? They don't want it to be known because the ramifications of that are too great. But the ramifications of not addressing it also are great. So diversions are created. And so by always bringing it back, bringing the people that you're talking to back to the topic, back, like keep bringing it back, that's how you can do that.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I have another question here, and it talks about lateral violence, and you might, want to say this. How does the state direct lateral violence between racialized community?
I have a lot of experience with lateral violence. I think many of us do, actually. There was a time that I was working with an Indigenous agency here in Toronto, and somebody that I once trusted betrayed that trust greatly. And it created a very unsafe working environment. And I became very, very upset. And a very dear friend of mine talked to me about the crab bucket, the Indigenous crab bucket. And the story goes that there was a white man and an Indigenous man walking down the beach collecting crabs. And the white man would pick up a crab, put the crab in his bucket, and he'd put the lid on his bucket. He'd find the next crab, take the lid off, pick up the crab, put the crab in his bucket, put the lid back on it, and so forth and so forth. And then he met an Indigenous man who was also collecting crabs on this beach. And he didn't have a lid. And all the crabs were climbing on top of one another and falling out of the bucket. And the white man says to the Indigenous man, your crabs are all fighting to get out of that bucket. You need to get a lid to put a lid on it. And he said, no, didn't you know this is an Indigenous crab bucket? And that's lateral violence, is when we start stepping on one another for success, for recognition, for power, for status, for whatever your reasons are doing it, is lateral violence needs to end. Because if we are going to continue with lateral violence, it is going to be very, very difficult for us to find solidarity. And that's what I mean by we really, like, this time of reflection is really about looking at ourselves so that we are not operating from a place of ego, right? And then working within these communities and upholding one another. Look at what happens when you don't have when you don't have that happening. You have people like Shane, a Mi'kmaq person contacting an Anishinaabe and saying, here's this great opportunity. Let me help you, let me raise your voice because I think you have something really important to say. And then bam, you have this opportunity. Whereas lateral violence would have went, oh, I'm going to do this myself, or I'm not going to ask anybody to participate in this because I want the capital gain on this, right? And in doing so, silencing the voices of others. So we need to be more mindful about lateral violence and what are our roles in this, and really checking our ego in this, because if we are not upholding one another and helping to create these kinds of spaces, then we're no different than the oppressor. So we need to be very mindful of lateral violence and how we are responding to it and how are we participating in it.
Mm-hmm. So there's a clarification to the question, and thank you for the person who asked. They're talking about the American government, and so I'm going to read it and feel free to comment. How does the state direct lateral violence, though? American government paid, they put the word Native people, to track, escape, enslaved Black people and offered Black people who were enslaved their freedom if they harmed an Indigenous person. That is my question. So that's where the person was coming from.
Okay, so I don't know all of the politics of what you're looking at, and I don't want to speak to those politics. But what I can speak to is that the powers that be understand that their success lies in our divisions. Okay, so this is why you've never seen before Black and Indigenous communities coming together and rising up It's really important for the powers that be that we are kept down and separated, two separate issues. This is why when we look at educational institutions, it is so difficult for things to happen in tandem. Why cannot Black Lives Matter also operate with equal importance as anti-Indigenous racism at the same time? All of these institutions like to bandwagon jump, if you will, for lack of a better term. They like to pick the hot topic and they like to show their support on that. But what happens is that it creates animosity. It says, oh, well, we had this momentum going. We were starting to see change. And now your focus and your attention is on the Black community or the Indigenous community. And then you start seeing a divide between those communities. And that is the powers that be. That is their way of keeping that oppression leveled and those communities divided, because they know if we come together, again, strength in numbers, right? So they work to keep the divide happening, and they do it in very distinct and different ways. So that is how the American and the Canadian government use lateral violence to keep communities that experience similar oppressions separate.
Thank you. There was a comment, tactics of white supremacy. I have a question somewhat related. How does capitalism cause scarcity or resources so communities stay divided?
Well, I think we need to look to Wet'suwet'en, and I think we need to look at Standing Rock, and I think we need to look at every other environmental protest that has occurred to see how capitalization really impacts not only culture, but way of life. It never ceases to amaze me how the capitalists get so upset over people being of land defenders, when it's not for the betterment of self, it's for the betterment of all mankind. It is to secure the human future on Mother Earth. And that is what the protests are about. But the capitalists take it so personally, like it's a personal attack. And I find this very incredibly frustrating. So that is how capitalism plays in creating the divide. It furthermore, we have like bills and legislation that really prevent protesting to happen without being charged with treason. We literally have like a piece of legislation that says that if you protest and disrupt the economic development of Canada, you will be charged with treason.
Yep. Yep.
So anybody that wants to become a water defender or a land defender technically can be charged with treason, because you are stopping the economic development of Canada by blocking a pipeline or blocking a highway to stop that pipeline from going in. When at the crux of it, we're saying we need clean drinking water for many generations ahead of us. Like, we need to secure our way of living. That will never change. As human beings, we will always need water. We will always need water to survive, healthy, clean water. And it amazes me how the capitalists of the world just, like, they just don't, it's like they can't see past the dollar sign, right? They can't see past the luxury and conveniences that they so long for and feel entitled to.
Absolutely. And thank you for reminding us that Bill C-51 still stands. That's very dangerous. Let me ask you something a little bit closer to home and not without controversy. Edgar Ryerson's statue. Should it stay or should it go?
I thought that this was going to cut in here somehow. All right. So this team had a wonderful conversation. The team that organized this event had a wonderful conversation about this yesterday. And we talked about what this all means. And while I always am on the side of students, and while I see that the removing of the statue could be a catalyst for further change, I am not 100% sure that the removal of the statue is going to give the relief that is needed to move for change. And the point was made is that even if you took down a statue, while that would have an immediate gratification, this school is still named after this individual that created the residential school system. And so the statue would become a stepping stone for something greater, like a name change. And for Ryerson University to rebrand, remarket, rename, you would be into the millions upon millions of dollars, where that money could be funneled out into creating more programs that support communities, more. But I recognize and I understand that that doesn't take the pain away. Believe me, I walk past that statue to teach classes all the time. And every time I'm very disheartened by it. And I have to do emotional management because I work there, right? Like I have to do the emotional management on myself to say like, it's okay that I'm employed here because what I'm doing is important. What the education that I'm providing is important. And that far precedes, the person that the school is named after. So with all of that being said, I am biased. So if it makes the student body and myself feel a little bit better to tear down that statue and place it somewhere else, tear down the damn statue and put it somewhere else.
I want to end in a wishful or a more hopeful note. What does the world we dream of look like?
It's like the miracle question for counselors. If you could wake up tomorrow and everything was perfect, what would it look like? I'd be prime minister. No, I'm kidding. I'm just joking. I don't want that gig. That's way too much pressure. If we could all wake up tomorrow and there would be not just equality, but equity. I think that when we often talk about equality, we forget about equity. And equity is equally as important as equality. And I'm not talking about the equity you have on your home. It's not the equity that I'm talking about. I'm talking about, that everybody has an equal share at equal cost to all resources and to all opportunities. So if I were to wake up tomorrow, we would have systems that are honoring those principles of legitimacy for all society members. It would look like no more watching people being hurt or discriminated against based on the color of their skin or the gender or the person that they love. That all of that would just be gone. And not to say that we would live in a utopian society, because that would probably get boring, but we would live in a society where there is equality and equity for everyone. Too long I have watched my kin, my brothers, my sisters, my cousins, my relatives be discriminated against. Too long have I watched the Black community's bodies being brutalized and murdered. Too long have I watched my sisters go missing with no consequence, no retribution. Too long I've been watching these things, and I'm only 42. But too long I've been watching these. So for me, what I hope that this change brings about is the reality of that miracle question. is that I do one day get to wake up, or my children one day get to wake up, or my grandchildren one day get to wake up, and none of this no longer exists. That Black bodies are no longer being brutalized, and Indigenous people aren't being disregarded as less than in a land that's theirs. You know, I want to take an opportunity just to, as I wrap up, just give my last few statements, is that I really hope that all of you heard the story of connection in the current social climate, and how we can use that connection to push towards solidarity, and how we could use that solidarity to push towards the change that we so badly need for that miracle question to become a reality. And while in most circumstances that are in my classroom, I'm always wanting to invite others to engage in more of a discussion. So it is my pleasure to announce that CESAR will be hosting a follow-up to this lecture, and we'll have a panelist Q&A event. I'm not sure about the timeline, but I'm sure CESAR will do their due diligence in promoting it and getting it out there. I am very happy to be a part of that panel group where we can extend this conversation and include all of the voices that did not get heard today. So with that being said, Chimiigwech, to CESAR, Ryerson, Janet, Shane, Ayet, Maddie, much love to all of you for this platform, and to all the family and friends and communities that have been sending me messages and supporting this event and sharing it, and just really honoring the space that's been given for these conversations to happen. So thank you so very, 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 very much. Chimiigwech.